Hello everybody, this is Mr. Mopin coming at you again with part 3 of the APUSH video focusing in on topic 4.8, President Jackson and federal power. Last time we talked about the election of Andrew Jackson to president, as president in 1828, and we started to kind of lay the groundwork for this idea of Andrew Jackson starting to kind of revolutionize what it means to be the president of the United States. And a lot of it comes from the fact that he is going to be the first, what we would call, common man president, coming from a very humble origin, the result of an electorate that is now overwhelmingly made up of working class Americans. And he's going to be, kind of taking this very broad base of support from the common American white man and believe that he has a mandate from these folks to be able to make decisions on their behalf. The idea being is that he truly believes that he knows what his supporters want, and he is going to take action. Presidents up to this point tended to be a little bit more, reactive, or at least maybe not reactive, but maybe more deferential to Congress and the other institutions before Jackson, but Jackson's going to be much more combative in terms of his fights with Congress and with the courts, and and much more willing to assert authority from the executive branch. Probably not a huge surprise, coming from the military, coming from being a former general. He's used to giving orders and not so much taking orders. Now, with that being said, what are Jackson's values? Well, Jackson's values are going to be, descended from, for the most part, from what are going to be these kind of traditional Democratic Republican values dating back to Jefferson. And that included a small, limited federal government. He believed that the federal government's powers should be limited in comparison to the states. And he is also going to definitely be a debt hawk. In other words, he very much wants to make sure that the United States is not indebted to anybody or anything. And in fact, during his presidency, we will actually see the national debt paid in full. It will be completely paid off. And note, it'll be the last time that America's national debt will be paid off. So this shows, a willingness to, by Jackson, to keep the federal government small and to keep its spending in check for sure. Something else that is going to be changing under Jackson's leadership is the willingness to use the veto. Remember, vetoes can be issued by presidents to prevent legislation that's been passed through Congress from becoming law. Now, for previous presidents, when thinking about using a veto, presidents only would issue a veto if they believe that the legislation that has been passed was truly unconstitutional. That, in other words, if it truly violated the bounds of what the federal government can do, then they would, conceivably veto that legislation. So this was done very, very, very minimally by the first 6 presidents of the United States. Jackson, different philosophy. For Jackson, his belief that a president should be able to use the veto power transcended a notion of constitutionality. For Jackson, it actually dealt with whether or not you personally, as president, agreed with the legislation, regardless of if it's constitutional or not. Previous presidents did not put their personal political, views into whether or not to veto the bill. Jackson will. And so Jackson's going to be more than willing to wield that veto stamp, if you will, and will kill 12 different bills during his presidency. Now, by modern standards, that's not a massive sum, but at that point in time, it was actually more presidential vetoes than the first 6 presidents combined. And so this is going to lead to, some of his critics kind of describing Jackson as acting as maybe a bit of an autocrat. And this is going to, kind of pick up momentum as we go through his presidency, with some of his critics eventually calling him King Andrew the First for him, kind of seemingly being high-handed. Anyhow, that being the case, Jackson is redefining what it means to be president. And it's not going to stop there. We're also going to be seeing Jackson redefined how to use the cabinet and how to use political advisors. Presidents up to this point in time had followed the model of George Washington, with the use of the cabinet officials being not just the folks that administer certain parts of the federal bureaucracy, like state or the treasury or something like that, but also being used as the chief political advisors for the president to get their advice on, what kind of actions to take. Jackson, once again, doesn't really follow that model. Jackson will be pressured by party bosses to appoint certain individuals that were of what is now starting to become the Democratic Party into some of these cabinet positions. But these were political appointments, not folks that Jackson necessarily truly 100% trusted and felt that he had 100% absolute loyalty from. For Jackson, you have to remember, loyalty is imperative. He believes that, those that he can trust are really only the ones that he wants advice from. And so what happens is that he will bring in more of his friends and extended family and things like that into the White House for the purpose of gaining their advice on certain political matters, not his formal cabinet members. And this informal group of advisors will get the moniker of kitchen cabinet. In other words, kind of an informal cabinet to help to advise him. So note, we're taking a look at a number of different ways that Jackson is redefining the presidency. And note, when we talk about these examples of the willingness to use the veto more, the willingness to kind of, jettison your formal cabinet members as advisors, this is not a one and done thing. This is going to influence future presidents to this very day. Now, when it comes to Jackson showing a willingness to, kind of pull rank and show who is boss, there's going to be many occasions during his presidency where that will be the case. But one of the early examples, we'll be dealing with a situation that for many of you, you might not, would not necessarily think of associating with Andrew Jackson. Squabbles amongst women in the executive branch. And the squabbling is centered around this young lady at the time, Peggy Eaton. So who was Peggy Eaton? Peggy Eaton was the wife of one of President Jackson's cabinet secretaries. I believe it was Secretary of War at the time. Now, what's the deal with Mrs. Eaton? Well, Mrs. Eaton came from fairly humble origins. She was the daughter of a tavern keeper, and because of her, pretty humble origin, there were rumors that, as somebody that worked in a tavern, she may have been a woman of ill repute. The idea being is that, prostitutes at that time, it was not unusual for prostitutes to work out of taverns at that time. So she, kind of had this rumor about her in terms of having a, less than, stellar reputation. But nonetheless, she was the wife of a important, powerful cabinet member. And so the expectation was that, she would socialize with the wives of the other cabinet members, including the wife of John C. Calhoun, who's going to be serving as the vice president at the time. But unfortunately for Mrs. Eaton, the other ladies of Washington will shun her. They will not socialize with her. They feel that she is of too low a reputation to be worthy to socialize with them. Well, eventually President Jackson gets wind of this, and if you haven't kind of thought about this yet, Jackson is going to be very, very upset at these other women, and he is going to be looking at Mrs. Eaton as somebody that he is going to have a lot of sympathy for. Remember, Eaton is not the only woman whose reputation has been dragged through the mud. You may recall President Jackson's wife, Rachel, had been, clearly slandered in the media, calling her all sorts of less than reputable names. And so Jackson was reminded, this situation reminded him of that. And so he will, try to defend the honor of Mrs. Eaton and basically order his cabinet secretaries. And, I know this seems kind of strange, imagine this happening today, but, President Jackson basically ordering his cabinet members to tell their wives that they must socialize with the Eatons. That it's, in essence, a presidential order. So, something that was, fairly, unprecedented before, is going to lead to some problems within Jackson's cabinet. John C. Calhoun, who I had mentioned, his wife was kind of the ringleader of the Washington wives that kind of shunned Mrs. Eaton, was basically forced to choose between loyalty to the President of the United States and loyalty to his wife, and he chose his wife. Calhoun was Vice President of the United States at the time, which meant that he may very well be a very serious contender to become president someday. And he was one of the most powerful voices from the American South at the time, hailing from South Carolina. But as a result of this dispute, Calhoun actually resigns his role as vice president to eventually make his way back to Congress. And so, once again, this is Jackson testing the loyalty of those that work for him. And if you are not loyal to him, he is not going to want you around. And that will then lead to Martin Van Buren, pictured here, becoming the next vice president for Andrew Jackson. And Martin Van Buren is going to be a very, very loyal supporter of Andrew Jackson. And speaking of, kind of the resurgence of political parties, Van Buren is going to be the mastermind of what will become the new Democratic Party. So Martin Van Buren, a very slick, very shrewd political agent who has come from New York, from middle-class origins. He's not from a wealthy family either, and has now made his way into the vice presidency and will basically become Andrew Jackson's chief lieutenant, or Chief Toady, depending on how you view Jackson. Now, to finish out this part, there's going to be, of course, some very, very, very controversial actions taken by Jackson that are nothing less than, well, let's be honest, disgusting. At a time where Native Americans are not viewed as American citizens, are not viewed as being entitled to the same rights and privileges as white men, and at a time where white Americans are salivating over the idea of claiming more and more lands west of the Appalachian Mountains in what was Native American territory, Jackson will work with Congress to create the Indian Removal Act. Now, what this Indian Removal Act will mark is the beginning of the movement of native tribes in what will be south of the Ohio River and west of the Appalachians out to the west of the Mississippi River. And why does Jackson support this? Well, once again, he is of the mindset of his supporters, and his supporters, working class Southern white guys, they want that land. They have no sense of believing that natives were entitled to really any rights at all. And even though Jackson is going to try to put a nice hat on this and try to make the claim that, hey, he's looking out for the interests of Native Americans, that he feels that they have to be moved in order to save them from being destroyed by white Americans that are going to make their way there anyway, it really is a sham. Even going to the lengths of defying the Supreme Court to carry out his goal of trying to move Native Americans out of the southern United States. In the case of Worcester v. Georgia, the Cherokee Nation had sued in court to, defy a Georgia law that had forcibly removed the Cherokee from their native lands. And the Supreme Court actually sided with the Cherokee, saying that they had rights as, in essence, a foreign nation to that land. Jackson refuses to enforce the ruling, telling Justice Marshall, Marshall's made his ruling, now let him enforce it. In other words, he's the one that enforces the rulings, not the court, so the court's opinions really don't matter. And so what will this mark? Well, this will mark the beginning of what will be the infamous Trail of Tears, which will see thousands and thousands, about 60,000 Native Americans being forced to travel from the American South, as you can see here, from places like Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, the Carolinas, and being forcibly moved at gunpoint out beyond the Mississippi and out towards Oklahoma. which will lead to the approximate deaths of 10,000 people. A horrible stain on Jackson's career. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.